Well, more now from the United States, where Donald Trump is expected to be met by protesters later when he arrives in the town in Texas, El Paso, where 22 people died in a shooting at the weekend. We go live now to Halifax in Nova Scotia, where we can speak to the Democratic strategist Spencer Critchley. So what do you make of the president's visit? Well, visits today. He's been to Ohio already, and we're told quite a warm, a lively reception awaiting him in El Paso.
I think with President Trump, we're supposed to pretend that he cares about anyone other than himself. We would normally extend that minimal respect to a president, but I think we see the pretense to believe that breaking down. President Trump's contribution to the environment that creates these white supremacist-related mass shootings is all too clear now. He's founded his political career on the racist birther lie, and he's been stoking racial resentments virtually every day since. So while we can't, of course, claim that he's personally directly responsible for any one of these incidents, he's obviously responsible for making the environment that encourages them. Okay. And I think we see the sense of that in these protests.
But I mean, in pure statistics, as the president himself pointed out, mass shootings took place under President Obama, they took place under President Bush, they took place under President Clinton. They've unfortunately been quite a long-time feature of the United States, of society as a whole, with or without comments from the president.
It's certainly true, but what we're seeing is a dramatic rise in white supremacist violence under President Trump. He's encouraging white supremacists. That's why if you ask white supremacists, or they'll volunteer their opinion, they're convinced he's one of them. And the statistics don't lie. White supremacist terrorism is now a far more serious problem in the United States than Islamic-related terrorism, Islamic radicalism-related terrorism. This is a president, of course, who does not want to recognize that obvious fact, and in fact has been defunding efforts to investigate violent white supremacist organizations.
Did you hear the president's comments before he got on Marine One on the helicopter, before he left on these visits, where he seemed to be softening a bit on the issue of some kind of, well, I wouldn't call it a crackdown, but some kind of increased controls on guns?
He's done that before and immediately buckled as soon as the NRA applied pressure on him. Within the same day, in one of the earlier incidents, he was reversing himself by that evening. This is typical of his behavior. I think the one sure lodestar to guide you towards understanding President Trump's behavior is what appears to him to be in his momentary self-interest. I don't think he has any principles on this issue at all.
So you don't think any follow-through on that. But what about his analysis that there's, in many of these cases, there's some kind of mental illness involved?
This is a notorious red herring that keeps being trotted out again by the National Rifle Association. President Trump gets his talking points from the television and directly from lobbying groups like the NRA. There's no higher incidence of mental illness in the United States, and yet we have an incredibly higher incidence of gun violence in the United States. Just like there's no higher use of video games and there's no established link whatsoever for a link between video game usage and violence. But these are the kinds of red herrings that get trotted out. There is a mountain of evidence that shows a correlation between ease of access to guns and gun violence. Now, we have to be careful not to confuse correlation with causation, but the correlation is dramatic across U.S. states and around the world in developed countries. When it's easier to get guns, there's more gun violence.
Well, let's put this in electoral terms. It may seem a little bit callous to do it, but that's unfortunately the way it works. You're a Democratic strategist. How should the Democrats respond to this? President Trump, as we well know, is very practiced at appealing to his so-called base. And presumably, well, we know that this kind of attitude appeals very much to them. What should Democrats say to counter it?
This is an interesting point. My opinion is that Democrats are actually, in general, very bad at talking about issues like guns. It's not uniformly true, but for the most part, I think they're very bad at it. And the problem is they come across as dismissing the values and concerns of honest gun owners. Too many Democrats lack familiarity with guns and gun culture, and too many of them come across as the notorious urban elites who don't understand why anybody would want to own a gun, and therefore they don't take the trouble to learn about why anybody would own a gun. When you actually talk to gun owners of good faith, which is most of them, they will offer you pretty good reasons for owning guns. You may disagree with them, but they're good faith reasons. And I think in any form of communication, especially persuasive communication, you need to start by showing you can listen, establish some trust based on common values, and then talk about it. And what you'll find is that 90% of gun owners support universal background checks, for example. It's the NRA that fights them because the NRA doesn't represent gun owners, it represents gun sellers and itself, apparently lining its own pockets, if we believe what we're hearing about mansions and private jets and Italian suits.
Well, it's been very interesting talking to you, Mr. Critchley. Thank you very much indeed for sparing the time. Spencer
It's my
Critchley.
pleasure, Dermot.
Now then,